The conference room in the Imperial Japanese Navy Ministry building sat on the third floor, its windows covered with blackout curtains even during the day. It was December 14th, 1944, and outside, Tokyo shivered under a cold winter rain. Inside, 6 officers of the Naval Intelligence Section huddled around a table covered in intercepted American documents, their faces illuminated by a single overhead lamp that cast harsh shadows across the pages. Lieutenant Commander Toshio Nakamura set down his pencil. For the past 6 weeks, he had been compiling logistical data intercepted from American communications across the Pacific Theater. The numbers before him represented the culmination of hundreds of decoded messages, captured documents from Saipan, reconnaissance photographs of American supply bases, and interrogation reports from captured American servicemen. And those numbers told a story that seemed impossible. According to his analysis, American forces in the Epot to the Africa Pacific were receiving an average of 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. Nakamura stared at the figure he had written at the bottom of his report. He checked his calculations again, then a third time. The number did not change. 12,500 tons, daily. Not for a major offensive, not as a build-up for a single operation. Every day, sustained, continuous. He knew what would happen when he presented this report to his superiors. They would not believe him. They would accuse him of miscalculation, of falling victim to American disinformation, perhaps even of defeatism. Because if this number were accurate, it would mean something that no one in this building wanted to accept, that Japan was not merely losing the war, but had already lost it, and everything that followed was simply the mathematical working out of an equation that had been determined the moment the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. This is the story of how Japanese military intelligence discovered the true scale of American industrial power and the psychological devastation that followed when they finally understood what they were actually fighting against. To understand the significance of what Nakamura had discovered, you must first understand the world in which Japanese military planners operated. In December of 1944, the war had been raging for 3 years. Japan had achieved stunning early victories, the conquest of the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. At its maximum extent in mid-1942, the Japanese Empire controlled a vast territory stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands to the approaches of Australia. But by late 1944, that empire was contracting. The Marianas had fallen in the summer. American forces under General Douglas MacArthur had returned to the Philippines in October. The Great Naval Battle of Leyte Gulf in late October had shattered Japanese naval power, leaving the combined fleet a shadow of its former strength. American submarines prowled the sea lanes, strangling Japan's merchant marine and cutting off the flow of raw materials from the southern territories. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Yet, within the corridors of power in Tokyo, there remained a stubborn conviction that the war could still be won, or at least fought to an honorable stalemate. This conviction rested on several pillars. First, the belief in Japanese spiritual superiority, the concept of Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, which supposedly gave Japanese soldiers an advantage over the materialistic, comfort-loving Americans. Second, faith in the defensive advantages of Japan's remaining island bastions, where every invasion would cost the Americans terrible casualties. Third, and perhaps most important, a fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial capacity and logistical capability. Japanese military doctrine had been shaped by decades of resource scarcity. Japan was a nation with limited natural resources, dependent on imports for oil, rubber, steel, and countless other materials essential to modern warfare. Japanese logistics operated on the principle of careful conservation. Supplies were accumulated for specific operations, then expended, then accumulated again. The idea of abundance, of having more supplies than you could possibly use, was foreign to Japanese military thinking. This scarcity shaped everything. Japanese soldiers in the field were expected to survive on minimal rations. The standard daily rice ration for a Japanese infantryman was 600 grams, roughly 21 ounces. When supply lines were stretched or disrupted, which they increasingly were by late 1944, soldiers were expected to live off the land, a euphemism for foraging, requisitioning from local populations, or simply going hungry. There were documented cases of Japanese garrisons in bypassed Pacific islands reduced to eating tree bark and grass. The Japanese term for this philosophy was seishin shugi, the primacy of spirit over matter. It was drilled into every soldier from basic training. Hardship was not merely endured but celebrated as a test of character. The ability to fight effectively despite hunger, despite exhaustion, despite inadequate equipment, was considered a mark of superior fighting spirit. This philosophy was not merely propaganda. It reflected genuine cultural values with roots in samurai tradition and Zen Buddhism, but it also served a practical purpose. It justified the chronic supply shortages that Japanese forces experienced throughout the war. If spiritual strength was more important than material abundance, then perhaps Japan's industrial weakness did not matter as much as the raw production numbers suggested. American military doctrine operated from precisely the opposite premise. The United States had emerged from the Great Depression with vast industrial capacity that had been underutilized throughout the 1930s. When war came, that industrial capacity was mobilized with stunning speed. American military logistics were built on the principle of overwhelming material superiority. Never send a soldier into combat without every possible advantage. If you can bring 2 of something instead of 1, bring 2. If you can have 1,000 tons of supplies instead of 500, have 1,000. This difference in philosophy was not merely academic. It manifested in every aspect of how the two nations fought the war. Consider the basic infantry ration. An American soldier in the Pacific received approximately 4,000 calories per day, along with cigarettes, candy, coffee, and other comfort items. The sea ration, the standard field ration, came in 6 different menus to provide variety. There were supplementary items, Coca-Cola, ice cream, fresh fruit when available. American quartermasters worked constantly to improve soldier morale through food. When Japanese intelligence officers interrogated captured American soldiers and sailors, they were often skeptical of stories about American supply abundance. It seemed too good to be true, more likely exaggeration or an attempt to demoralize the interrogators. Surely, they reasoned, no military could sustain such abundance across thousands of miles of ocean. But Lieutenant Commander Nakamura was a meticulous man. He had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1932, ranking 14th in his class. He had studied English and had spent time before the war analyzing American military journals and technical publications. Unlike many of his colleagues, he had a realistic appreciation for American industrial capacity. But even he found the numbers he was now compiling difficult to credit. His investigation had begun in October of 1944, shortly after the fall of Saipan. Among the documents captured when that island fell were American quartermaster records, routine logistics paperwork that had been left behind in the chaos of battle. These records showed supply deliveries to Saipan in specific tonnage figures. The numbers were high, but Nakamura initially assumed they represented a build-up for the invasion itself. Then came the intercepts. Japanese cryptanalysis had achieved some success against lower-level American codes, particularly those used for routine logistics communications. These messages were less carefully encrypted than strategic intelligence, and they dealt with mundane subjects, requisition orders, shipping manifests, inventory reports, but patterns began to emerge. From MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command, daily supply requirements for operations in New Guinea and the Philippines. From Admiral Chester Nimitz's Central Pacific Forces, logistics reports from bases in the Marianas, the Marshalls, the Carolines. From fleet communications, fuel consumption rates, ammunition expenditure reports, food requisitions. Nakamura created a systematic tracking system. He catalogued every supply-related intercept, organized them by date and location, and began building a comprehensive picture of American logistics in the Pacific. The work was tedious and time-consuming. Many intercepts were fragmentary. Some were clearly routine housekeeping communications with little strategic value. But slowly, meticulously, he assembled the pieces. By early December, a pattern had emerged that was unmistakable. The high-tonnage figures were not anomalies. They were not build-ups for specific operations. They were standard operating procedures. Week after week, month after month, American forces across the Pacific were receiving enormous quantities of supplies on a continuous, sustained basis. Nakamura cross-referenced his findings with reconnaissance photographs. Japanese long-range aircraft, flying at extreme altitude, had photographed American bases in the Pacific. The photographs showed anchorages crowded with cargo ships, supply dumps that covered acres, fuel tank farms with dozens of storage tanks. At Ulithi Atoll, in the Caroline Islands, which the Americans had occupied in September, aerial reconnaissance revealed what appeared to be the largest naval anchorage in the world. Hundreds of ships clustered in a lagoon, supply vessels, repair ships, tankers, floating dry docks. He interviewed intelligence officers who had interrogated captured Americans. The stories were consistent. American servicemen spoke casually about mail from home arriving regularly, about base exchanges where you could buy chocolate and cigarettes, about movie theaters and ice cream parlors at rear area bases. One captured sailor from a destroyer had described in detail the daily routine on his ship: 3 hot meals a day, coffee always, available, regular replenishment of food and fuel from supply vessels that seemed to materialize whenever needed. The picture that emerged was of a military machine operating on a scale that seemed to violate everything Nakamura understood about warfare. The numbers he compiled showed that American forces in the Pacific were receiving more supplies in a single day than the entire Japanese military produced for all its theaters: China, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, in 3 days. He wrote his report carefully, knowing how explosive its contents were. He included detailed sourcing for every figure, cross-references between different types of intelligence, photographs, and captured documents as supporting evidence. His conclusion was stark and unambiguous. American forces in the Pacific Theater were receiving an average of 12,500 tons of supplies per day, and this figure appeared to be sustainable indefinitely. When he submitted the report to his section chief, Commander Masao Yoshida, on December 12th, the response was immediate skepticism. Yoshida read through the report twice, then looked up at Nakamura. "You're certain of these calculations?" I have checked them multiple times, sir. The sources are diverse and independent. They corroborate each other. 12,500 tons per day. Yoshida said the words slowly, as if testing their plausibility. That would mean over 370,000 tons per month. Yes, sir. That's more than our entire military production. Yes, sir. Yoshida was silent for a long moment. This will need to go higher. The admirals will want to see this. A meeting was arranged for December 14th at Imperial General Headquarters. Present were representatives from both the Army and Navy, including Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, recently returned from the Philippines, and Lieutenant General Yoshijiro Umezu, Deputy Chief of the Army General Staff. These were serious men, career officers who had dedicated their lives to military service. They were not fools, and they were not blind to Japan's deteriorating strategic situation. But they were products of a system that valued determination and fighting spirit above material considerations. Nakamura presented his findings. He spoke clearly and methodically, walking through his methodology, showing the captured documents, the intercept logs, the reconnaissance photographs. He explained how he had cross-referenced multiple independent sources to verify the figures. He showed the calculations step by step. The room was silent as he spoke. When he finished, the silence continued for several long seconds. Then General Umezu spoke. These figures are impossible. Sir, I have verified them through. I am not questioning your diligence, Commander. I am questioning the premise. If the Americans could deliver such quantities on a sustained basis, they would have already overwhelmed us through sheer weight of material. The war would be over. With respect, sir, Nakamura said carefully, that may be precisely what is happening. The statement hung in the air like smoke. No one spoke. The implication was clear and terrible. If Nakamura's analysis was correct, then Japan was not engaged in a war that might be won or lost based on strategy, tactics, or fighting spirit. Japan was engaged in a war that had already been decided by industrial arithmetic, and everything that followed was simply playing out of a mathematical certainty. Vice Admiral Fukudome broke the silence. Let us consider the implications if these figures are accurate. 12,500 tons per day equals approximately 4.5 million tons per year. Delivered to the Pacific Theatre alone. Yes, sir, Nakamura confirmed. Japan's total steel production in 1944 was approximately 2.4 million tons. For the entire nation, civilian and military combined, the comparison was devastating in its simplicity. The supplies America was delivering to just one theatre of operations exceeded Japan's total steel production for an entire year. Another officer spoke up, Captain Shigeo Yamada, a logistics specialist. Commander Nakamura, what is the source of these supplies? Are they being shipped from the continental United States? Yes, sir. The primary embarkation ports are San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, and Los Angeles. But there are also significant supplies being shipped from Australia and forward bases in Hawaii. And the shipping required for this? Nakamura had anticipated this question. Based on standard cargo vessel capacity, delivering 12,500 tons per day would require approximately 600 cargo ships per month arriving at Pacific destinations. This assumes an average cargo capacity of 6,000 tons per vessel and turnaround times of approximately 30 days. 600 ships per month, Yamada repeated the figure. That would require a merchant fleet of thousands of vessels. The Americans have built approximately 2,700 Liberty ships since 1941, Nakamura said. These are standardized cargo vessels, mass-produced in American shipyards. Construction time for a Liberty ship has been reduced to an average of 42 days. One shipyard in California built a complete vessel in less than 5 days as a demonstration. This figure, a complete ocean-going cargo ship built in less than a week, seemed to strain credulity even more than the tonnage. Figures. But Nakamura had the documentation. He showed them intelligence reports on American shipbuilding, including photographs of the massive shipyards on the West Coast, where dozens of vessels were under construction simultaneously. General Umezu studied the photographs. "This is industrial capacity on a scale we cannot match." "No, sir," Nakamura agreed quietly. "Cannot match now, or cannot match ever." "Cannot match ever, sir. Even if our industrial plant were operating at full capacity with unlimited access to raw materials, we could not approach these production levels. The disparity is too great." The meeting continued for another hour, with officers asking detailed questions about Nakamura's methodology, challenging specific figures, looking for flaws in the analysis. But the conclusion was inescapable. The numbers were real. The scale of American supply operations in the Pacific was genuine, and the implications were catastrophic for Japanese strategic planning. As the meeting concluded, Admiral Fukudome made a statement that would later be recorded in post-war interrogations. "If these figures are accurate," he said, "then we are not fighting a nation, we are fighting a force of nature, and you cannot defeat a force of nature through tactics or courage. You can only endure it or be swept away by it. But understanding the truth and accepting its implications are two different things." The meeting ended with orders for Nakamura to continue monitoring American logistics, to provide regular updates, to watch for any changes or vulnerabilities in the American supply system. There was no discussion of surrender, no suggestion that the war might be unwinnable. The institutional machinery of the Japanese military continued to operate, issuing orders, planning operations, moving units, as if the mathematical reality revealed by Nakamura's report did not exist. To truly understand what 12,500 tons per day represented, you must visualize it. Imagine a cargo train stretching across the horizon, freight car after freight car, loaded with food, ammunition, fuel, vehicles, medical supplies, construction materials, spare parts. That train would need to be approximately 25 miles long to carry 12,500 tons of cargo. Now imagine that train arriving every single day, not once, not for a special operation, every day, continuously, without pause. That is what American logistics delivered to the Pacific Theater in late 1944. Let us break down what those 12,500 tons actually contained. The U.S. Army's Technical Manual TM 10-276, published in 1943, specified the daily supply requirements for a division of approximately 15,000 men. The manual listed requirements by category: Class I supplies, which were subsistence items, food and water; Class II, which included clothing, weapons and equipment; Class III, which was petroleum products; Class IV, construction materials; and Class V, ammunition. A single American infantry division in active operations required approximately 650 tons of supplies per day. This figure could spike dramatically during intense combat when ammunition expenditure soared, but 650 tons was the sustained baseline. By December 1944, American forces in the Pacific included approximately 21 divisions plus supporting units, air forces, and naval forces. 12,500 tons per day was not an excess. It was what was required to keep this force fed, armed, mobile, and combat effective. But the supplies themselves tell only part of the story. The infrastructure required to deliver them was equally staggering. Begin at the source. The continental United States, 6,000 miles from the front lines. American factories produced the materials food canned in facilities across the Midwest, uniforms sewn in textile mills in the Carolinas, ammunition manufactured in ordnance plants that had been farmland 3 years earlier. These materials flowed to West Coast ports where stevedores worked around the clock loading cargo ships. The U.S. Maritime Commission had overseen the construction of specialized port facilities with modern cranes and conveyor systems that could load a 10,000-ton cargo ship in less than 24 hours. This was revolutionary efficiency. By comparison, Japanese ports in 1944 often required 4 to 5 days to load a comparable vessel. The ships themselves were marvels of standardized production. The Liberty ship design sacrificed speed and elegance for cargo capacity and ease of construction. They were ugly, utilitarian vessels, but they were built in such numbers that losing one to submarine attack or accident was merely an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. By late 1944, American shipyards were completing an average of 3 Liberty ships per day. These ships traveled in convoys, protected by destroyer escorts, and increasingly in late 1944 by the overwhelming superiority of American naval power in the Pacific. Japanese submarine commanders had initially hoped to strangle American supply lines as German U-boats had done in the Atlantic, but Japanese submarines were designed primarily for attacking warships, not merchant vessels. And, by late 1944, Japanese submarine strength had been whittled down by attrition. American supply convoys crossed the Pacific with increasing confidence that they would arrive unmolested. The ships docked at forward bases Pearl Harbor, which had been transformed from the wreckage of December 1941 into the most capable port facility in the Pacific, Eniwetok in the Marshall Islands, where Seabees had built a complete naval base from scratch, Ulithi Atoll, where the lagoon provided anchorage for hundreds of ships simultaneously. At these bases, supplies were sorted, stored in warehouses and open-air dumps, and then transshipped to advanced bases closer to the front lines. The system operated with mechanical precision. Ships arrived on schedule. Cargo was unloaded, inventoried, stored, and moved forward according to predetermined plans. Delays were anomalies, not norms. When a unit needed supplies, those supplies arrived when promised. This reliability was, perhaps, the most revolutionary aspect of American logistics. Japanese units fighting in the Pacific had learned to expect that promised supplies might arrive late, might arrive in reduced quantities, or might not arrive at all. American units expected their supplies to arrive when and where promised, and were shocked and outraged on the rare occasions when they did not. Consider a specific example: the 1st Marine Division fighting on Peleliu in September and October of 1944. Peleliu was a small island, less than 6 square miles, but the fighting was brutal. Japanese defenders had constructed an elaborate system of caves and fortifications. American casualties were severe. The operation, originally planned to take 4 days, stretched into 2 months of savage combat. Throughout this battle, American logistics functioned with barely a hiccup. Supply ships arrived offshore daily. Landing craft ferried supplies from ship to shore. Ammunition was abundant, so abundant, that American commanders could call for massive artillery bombardments without worrying about running short. Water, critically important in the tropical heat, was delivered in tank trucks and blister bags. Food arrived hot when possible, cold rations when necessary, but always in adequate quantities. Medical supplies flowed continuously, enabling doctors and corpsmen to treat casualties with the full range of modern pharmaceuticals. Casualties themselves were evacuated by ship to hospital facilities in the rear, where they received care that would have been considered miraculous a generation earlier. This abundance came at a cost, of course. The U.S. Navy lost one escort carrier to Japanese submarine attack during the Peleliu operation. Several cargo ships and landing craft were damaged, but the losses were absorbed without disrupting the supply flow. More ships arrived. The supplies kept coming. Compare this to the Japanese experience on Peleliu. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded the term Japanese garrison of approximately 11,000 men. His orders were to defend the island as long as possible, inflicting maximum casualties on the Americans. He executed these orders brilliantly from a tactical standpoint, using the cave system to create a defense in depth that exacted a terrible price from the Marines. But his supplies were finite. He had what he had brought to the island, plus minimal reinforcement that trickled in before American naval supremacy closed the sea lanes. When his ammunition ran low, it stayed low. When his men went hungry, they stayed hungry. When medical supplies ran out, the wounded went untreated. By the time the battle ended in late November, with Nakagawa's ritual suicide after the last organized resistance collapsed, the Americans had expended more supplies supporting their division than the Japanese had supplied to their entire garrison at the start of the battle. This pattern repeated across the Pacific, at Saipan, at Guam. At every engagement, American forces brought not merely superior numbers, but vastly superior logistical support, and Japanese intelligence officers, analyzing the battles, tried to understand how this was possible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Part of the answer lay in a concept that Japanese planners struggled to comprehend: logistical redundancy. American supply planning included massive safety margins. If a division was calculated to need 650 tons per day, supply officers would plan to deliver 750 or 800 tons, just to be safe. If an operation required 10 days of supplies, planners would stockpile 15 or 20 days' worth. This seemed wasteful to Japanese officers, who were accustomed to operating on thin margins where every ton of supplies had to be carefully allocated and used. But redundancy provided resilience. When things went wrong, and in war, things always go wrong, American forces had buffer stocks to draw on. A delayed supply ship was an inconvenience, not a crisis. Unexpectedly heavy ammunition expenditure could be accommodated. The system could absorb shocks that would cripple a more tightly stretched supply chain. This redundancy extended to equipment as well. American units in the Pacific were issued far more vehicles than equivalent Japanese units. A.U.S. Infantry regiment might have 300 trucks. A Japanese regiment might have 30. The Americans used vehicles lavishly to move supplies, to transport troops, to evacuate casualties, sometimes even for administrative convenience. Japanese vehicles were precious resources, carefully husbanded, used only when absolutely necessary. The abundance of vehicles created mobility that Japanese forces could not match. American units could redeploy rapidly, could shift supplies to meet changing needs, could outmaneuver opponents who were largely tied to foot movement. In the Philippines, American mechanized columns ranged across Leyte, while Japanese defenders, even when they wanted to maneuver, were constrained by the lack of transport. Even small details reflected the supply disparity. American soldiers in the Pacific carried entrenching tools, extra canteens, spare socks, cigarettes, candy, writing paper, water purification tablets, insect repellent, and numerous other items that made life in the field marginally more bearable. Japanese soldiers carried a rifle, a bayonet, perhaps 50 rounds of ammunition, and a small bag of rice. Everything else was luxury. This difference was not merely about morale or comfort, though those mattered. It was about combat effectiveness. A well-supplied soldier fights better than a hungry one. A soldier who can call on abundant artillery support can take risks that would be suicidal without that support. A unit with reliable medical evacuation fights with less fear because soldiers know that a wound does not mean death from neglect. The psychological impact of this disparity was devastating for Japanese troops who encountered it. Captured Japanese soldiers interviewed after battles expressed stunned disbelief at what they had seen. They told interrogators about American positions lit by electric lights at night, powered by portable generators, about tanks and trucks seemingly without numbers, about artillery bombardments that turned landscapes into moonscapes. The aircraft overhead was so numerous they literally darkened the sky. Many refused to believe they had been fighting fair fights. There must be trickery involved, they insisted. The Americans must have somehow concentrated all their resources for this particular battle, leaving other fronts weakened. This could not possibly be the norm, but it was the norm. This was how American forces fought everywhere, all the time. The abundance was systematic, not exceptional. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura understood this in December of 1944 as he compiled his report. The 12,500 tons per day was not a temporary build-up. It was the baseline operational supply, and according to the intelligence he was seeing, it was increasing. American logistics officers were planning to expand supply deliveries in preparation for the eventual invasion of Japan itself. The numbers Nakamura calculated for that planned invasion were even more staggering. Operation Downfall, as the invasion plans were codenamed, called for supply delivery rates exceeding 20,000 tons per day during the assault phases. And American logistics officers, when interrogated after the war, confirmed that they had been confident they could meet those requirements. The infrastructure was being built. The ships were being constructed. The supplies were being manufactured and stockpiled. From the Japanese perspective, this was incomprehensible. How could any nation produce so much? How could any economy sustain such expenditure? Where did all the material come from? The answer lay in American industrial capacity, operating at a scale that had no parallel in Japanese experience. Consider steel production, the foundation of modern industrial warfare. In 1944, the United States produced approximately 80 million tons of steel. Japan produced 2.4 million tons. The ratio was more than 30 to 1. This disparity cascaded through everything else. More steel meant more ships, more tanks, more artillery pieces, more trucks, more of everything that moved, shot, or protected. It meant more construction beams for building bases and warehouses, more rails for transportation networks, more structural material for factories to build still more weapons, or consider aluminum, essential for aircraft production. In 1944, the United States produced approximately 920,000 tons of aluminum. Japan produced about 70,000 tons. American aircraft production that year was nearly 100,000 planes. Japanese production was 28,000 planes, and by late 1944, many of those aircraft were obsolescent designs or hastily built models with serious quality control problems. The disparity in oil production was perhaps most critical. The United States in 1944 produced approximately 1.7 billion barrels of oil. Japan produced essentially zero. The home islands had no significant oil reserves. Japan's entire war strategy had been premised on seizing the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and maintaining a merchant marine large enough to transport that oil back to Japan. By late 1944, American submarines had sunk so much of Japan's tanker fleet that oil imports had slowed to a trickle. Japanese industry was being strangled by lack of fuel. These raw production numbers translated directly into military capability. An American aircraft carrier task force could operate at high speed for extended periods because fuel was abundant. Japanese carriers, the few that remained by late 1944, had to conserve fuel, limiting their operational range and flexibility. An American armored division could maneuver aggressively because fuel trucks kept the tanks running. Japanese armored units husbanded fuel so carefully that tanks sometimes moved short distances to save their precious fuel supplies. The implications extended beyond combat operations. Training suffered when fuel was scarce. Japanese pilots by 1944 received drastically reduced flight training compared to their earlier counterparts because there was not enough aviation fuel for extensive training flights. This created a vicious cycle. Poorly trained pilots were shot down more easily, creating a need for replacement pilots who also received inadequate training because fuel remained scarce. American pilots, by contrast, received hundreds of hours of flight training before entering combat. When they did enter combat, they flew aircraft that were newer, faster, and more capable than what they were replacing. Japanese pilots flew aircraft that were increasingly obsolete, and when those aircraft were shot down, the replacements were often inferior to what had been lost. All of this was visible in the intelligence Nakamura compiled, but seeing it and accepting it were different matters. The institutional culture of the Japanese military did not easily accommodate the idea that the war might be unwinnable for reasons that had nothing to do with tactics, strategy, or fighting spirit. The whole edifice of Japanese military thought was built on the premise that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage. Commanders had risen through a system that rewarded aggression and determination. Strategic planning emphasized offensive action and the decisive battle that would turn the war in Japan's favor. To accept Nakamura's analysis meant accepting that none of that mattered. It meant accepting that the war had been lost before it began, that the industrial arithmetic had doomed Japan from December 7th, 1941 onward, and that everything since had been a slow-motion tragedy playing out according to mathematical certainty. Some officers did accept this. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, had understood from the beginning. He had studied in the United States, had traveled across America, and had seen the industrial heartland. He had warned his superiors before the war that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but that if the war extended beyond that, the outcome was certain. He had been proven tragically right. His death in April 1943, when American fighters intercepted his plane over Bougainville, had removed one of the few senior officers who genuinely understood what Japan was up against. Others refused to see. They convinced themselves that American willpower was weak, that the United States would tire of the war, that heavy casualties would lead to demands for peace. They pointed to American political debates, to isolationist voices, to any evidence that American resolve might falter. They ignored the fact that American industrial production continued to increase, that supply deliveries grew rather than shrank, that the noose around Japan was tightening inexorably. In December of 1944, as Nakamura presented his report, the war still had 9 more months to run. 9 months of additional destruction, additional casualties, additional suffering. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 would kill more than 80,000 people in a single night. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa would cost tens of thousands of American and hundreds of thousands of Japanese lives. The atomic bombs in August would obliterate Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All of this was, in a sense, preordained by the numbers Nakamura had calculated, not the specific events. No one in December 1944 knew about atomic weapons or could predict exactly how the war would end, but the trajectory was set. The outcome was determined. Japan could not win. Japan could only decide how much destruction it would endure before accepting the inevitable. The meeting in December 1944 ended without any dramatic decisions. There was no announcement that the war was lost, no sudden pivot to peace negotiations. The institutional machinery continued operating. Orders went out, units moved, operations were planned. But something had shifted, subtly but irrevocably, in the minds of those who had seen Nakamura's report. In the weeks that followed, Nakamura continued his work. He tracked American supply shipments, monitored logistics, communications, and compiled data. The numbers did not improve from Japan's perspective. If anything, they worsened. By January 1945, his estimates showed American supply deliveries approaching 14,000 tons per day. The trend line pointed inexorably upward. Other intelligence officers began paying attention to logistics in ways they had not before. Captain Yamada, the logistics specialist who had attended the December meeting, requested copies of Nakamura's raw data. He began conducting his own analysis, focusing on specific commodities. His findings were equally grim. American ammunition expenditure in the Philippines campaign, for example, exceeded Japan's total ammunition production for all theaters in the same period. The psychological impact of these revelations varied among those who encountered them. Some officers responded with denial, insisting the figures must be exaggerated or that American logistics would eventually falter. Others responded with a kind of fatalistic determination: if the war was lost, then the duty was to make the end as costly as possible for the enemy, to die with honor rather than surrender in disgrace. A small number began, quietly and carefully, to consider alternatives. These men did not speak openly about surrender. Such talk was dangerous, potentially treasonous. But in private conversations, in carefully worded memoranda, they began to explore what peace might look like, what terms might be acceptable, how Japan might end the war without complete national destruction. These quiet conversations took place against a backdrop of increasing catastrophe. In January 1945, American forces invaded Luzon in the Philippines. The Japanese defense, though fierce, could not prevent the fall of Manila by early March. The defenders fought building by building, but they fought with dwindling supplies of ammunition and food, while American forces brought overwhelming firepower to bear. In February, American Marines assaulted Iwo Jima, a barren volcanic island less than 8 square miles in size, but strategically positioned between the Marianas and Japan. The Japanese garrison of 21,000 men had transformed the island into a fortress, with miles of tunnels and hundreds of fortified positions. They fought with desperate courage, but they fought without hope of resupply or reinforcement. Every bullet fired was one less in their finite stockpile. Every casualty was a permanent loss. Meanwhile, American forces offshore had essentially unlimited ammunition to support their advance. The battle lasted more than a month and cost nearly 7,000 American lives, but the outcome was never in doubt. The defenders simply ran out of men before the attackers ran out of supplies. Nakamura followed these battles through intelligence reports and his own analysis. He could see the pattern. Japanese defenses were effective tactically but irrelevant strategically. They could inflict casualties, could delay American advances, but could not alter the fundamental equation. American forces could afford to take casualties because replacements arrived. They could afford to expend ammunition lavishly because more was always available. They could afford to take time because their supply situation actually improved the longer they took to prepare. In March 1945, a different kind of attack began. American B-29 bombers, operating from bases in the Marianas, began large-scale incendiary raids on Japanese cities. The raid on Tokyo on the night of March 9th was devastating beyond precedent. More than 300 bombers dropped nearly 1,700 tons of incendiary bombs on a densely populated area of the city. The resulting firestorm killed more than 80,000 people and left more than 1 million homeless. The tonnage figures were grimly ironic. 1,700 tons, less than 1/7 of what American forces received in daily supplies, were delivered in a single night to create destruction on a scale Japan had never experienced. And this was just the beginning. In the months that followed, American bombers systematically burned Japanese cities. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, city after city experienced the firestorm. By summer, more than 60 cities had been attacked. Millions were homeless. Industrial production collapsed. The bombing campaign was itself a demonstration of American logistical superiority. Each B-29 required enormous support: fuel, bombs, spare parts, maintenance. The bases in the Marianas that supported the bomber offensive received supplies by the same system that fed the combat forces, the endless stream of cargo ships crossing the Pacific. The bombers themselves had been built in factories across America and flown to the Pacific via a route that included stops in California, Hawaii, and various intermediate bases. The entire system operated with mechanical precision. Japanese air defenses proved largely ineffective. Fighter aircraft were too few and too slow to intercept the high-flying bombers effectively. Anti-aircraft artillery was hampered by obsolete fire control systems and shortages of ammunition. The B-29s flew their missions with increasing confidence that they would return safely. In April 1945, American forces invaded Okinawa, the largest and bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Okinawa was Japanese home territory, part of the prefecture system, with a substantial civilian population. The Japanese defense was ferocious. The garrison of more than 77,000 troops was supported by thousands of Okinawan conscripts and militia. They fought from fortified positions, launched counterattacks, and employed kamikaze aircraft in massive numbers against the American fleet offshore. The kamikaze attacks were themselves a product of the realization that conventional warfare was unwinnable. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who had attended the December 1944 briefing, had subsequently organized the first systematic kamikaze operations. His logic was stark. If Japan could not win through material superiority, perhaps it could win through spiritual superiority, through the willingness to die that American soldiers supposedly lacked. One aircraft, one pilot, one ship, perhaps that equation could shift the balance. It could not. The kamikaze attacks sank or damaged hundreds of American ships, killed thousands of American sailors, but they did not alter the strategic situation. For every aircraft that dove into an American ship, 10 more American ships arrived. For every American vessel damaged, repair ships and supply vessels provided the spare parts and materials needed to restore them to service. The kamikaze attacks inflicted pain but not strategic damage. The battle for Okinawa lasted nearly 3 months and cost more than 12,000 American lives and more than 100,000 Japanese military and civilian deaths. But throughout those 3 months, American supply lines functioned without interruption. Ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, everything arrived on schedule. The American forces that captured Okinawa in June were better supplied at the end of the battle than they had been at the beginning. Nakamura tracked all of this from his office in Tokyo. His reports continued to circulate among senior officers. By spring of 1945, the logistical reality he had documented in December was accepted by most of the military leadership, though not always acknowledged openly. They knew they were being buried under American material superiority. They knew the Japanese industry could not compete. They knew the end was approaching. But knowing and acting on that knowledge remained separate matters. The Japanese government was paralyzed by internal divisions. Military hardliners insisted on fighting to the end, making the invasion of Japan so costly that America would agree to conditional surrender that preserved some form of the imperial system. Civilian leaders and some military moderates recognized that continuing the war meant only additional destruction without changing the outcome. The emperor himself, who had remained largely passive during the war's prosecution, began to ask more pointed questions about the strategic situation. In July 1945, the Potsdam Declaration demanded Japan's unconditional surrender. The Japanese government's response was ambiguous, interpreted by the Allies as rejection. Behind the scenes, desperate diplomatic efforts sought some avenue to peace that would preserve the emperor's position, but these efforts went nowhere. Then, in early August, everything changed. On August 6th, a single American B-29 dropped a single bomb on Hiroshima. The bomb was unlike anything that had come before, not incendiaries, not high explosives, but a weapon that released the power of atomic fission. The explosion obliterated the city center and killed an estimated 70,000 people immediately, with tens of thousands more dying from radiation and injuries in the following weeks. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. The atomic bombs were not, from a purely logistical standpoint, more destructive than the conventional bombing campaign. The March raid on Tokyo had killed more people than either atomic bomb, but the psychological impact was different. One bomb, one aircraft, one city destroyed. The implication was clear. America could obliterate Japanese cities one by one without risking crews, without massive logistics efforts, without warning. And behind the atomic attacks lay the same remorseless logistical reality that Nakamura had documented months earlier. America had built these weapons through an industrial program that cost more than $2 billion and employed more than 120,000 people at facilities across the country. The Manhattan Project itself was a demonstration of American capacity to mobilize resources on a scale Japan could not match. And if America could build 2 atomic bombs, it could build more. The supply chain existed, the expertise was proven, the weapons were operational. On August 9th, the same day as the Nagasaki bombing, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. The Kwantung Army, once the most powerful formation in the Japanese military, collapsed under the Soviet assault. The Northern Front, which Japanese planners had hoped might remain quiet, was suddenly active and catastrophically lost. Emperor Hirohito, presented with this convergence of catastrophes, made the decision his military leadership had been unable or unwilling to make. He would accept the Potsdam terms. He would end the war. On August 15, his voice was broadcast by radio to the Japanese people for the first time. Speaking in formal court Japanese that many listeners found difficult to understand, he announced that the war would end, that Japan would surrender, that the empire must endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable. The announcement provoked attempted coups by military officers who wanted to continue the war, but these efforts failed. On September 2, 1945, Japanese officials boarded the American battleship Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, and signed the instruments of surrender. The Second World War was over. The delegation that went to the Missouri traveled there through Tokyo Bay waters crowded with American warships, battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and behind them, supply ships, repair ships, hospital ships. The visual demonstration of American naval power was overwhelming. Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet comprised more than 260 ships. They filled the bay from horizon to horizon. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, who had attended Nakamura's briefing in December 1944, was not part of the surrender delegation, but he witnessed the scene. In post-war interrogations, he recalled, standing on shore and looking at the assembled fleet. He told his interrogators that he thought of Nakamura's report of the number 12,500 tons per day, and he finally understood viscerally what that number had meant. Each of those ships represented not just a vessel, but an entire supply chain, the factories that built it, the shipyards that launched it, the ports that loaded it, the crews that sailed it, multiplied across hundreds of ships, sustained for years. That was the reality of American power. Nakamura himself survived the war. In the chaos of Japan's surrender and occupation, his intelligence reports ended up in American hands. Interrogators from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey interviewed him extensively. They wanted to understand what Japanese intelligence had known, when they had known it, how they had responded to it. Nakamura answered their questions with the same methodical precision he had brought to his original analysis. He explained his methodology, showed them his calculations, and described the December 1944 meeting. The American interrogators were fascinated. They had not realized that Japanese intelligence had so accurately assessed American logistics. They asked why, if Japan knew the true situation, the war would have continued for 9 more months. Nakamura's answer was simple and tragic. We knew the numbers. We understood what they meant. But institutions do not change course easily, especially military institutions in wartime. And there was always the hope that somehow, despite the arithmetic, we might achieve terms that would preserve something of what we had been. That hope kept the war going long after rational calculation said it was lost. The interrogators pressed him. Had he advocated for surrender? Had he argued that the war was unwinnable? Nakamura's response revealed the constraints he had operated under. I was an intelligence officer. My duty was to provide accurate information, not to make strategic recommendations. I reported what I found. What senior officers chose to do with that information was not my decision. This answer satisfied the Americans from a bureaucratic standpoint, but it highlighted a deeper truth about how the war had been prolonged. Information alone does not drive decisions. Even accurate, verified, undeniable information can be ignored or rationalized away when it conflicts with institutional imperatives or psychological needs. The 12,500 tons per day had been real. The logistical disparity had been genuine. The implications had been clear. But knowing these things had not been enough to stop the war. It had taken atomic bombs, Soviet invasion, and complete collapse of all alternatives to force acceptance of what the numbers had been saying since at least December 1944. In the post-war years, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, the logistics story became part of the war's historical record. Japanese military officers writing memoirs acknowledged the vast material disparity. Historians analyzing the war examined the industrial production figures and confirmed what Nakamura had reported. The conclusion was inescapable. Japan had fought a war it could not win against an opponent whose industrial capacity was so superior that the outcome was determined before the first shots were fired. Some former officers argued that Japan had no choice but to fight. The American oil embargo in 1941 had threatened Japan with economic strangulation. War seemed preferable to slow collapse. Admiral Yamamoto's plan to strike hard early and seek negotiated peace had appeared logical within the constraints Japan faced. But the logic had been flawed from the beginning. It had assumed that America would tire of war, that heavy casualties would break American will, that Japanese determination could substitute for American abundance. Every one of these assumptions had proven false. America was not tired. American willpower had proven at least as strong as Japanese determination. And determination without resources was simply not enough. The broader lesson that industrial capacity is decisive in modern warfare seemed clear. The nation that could produce more steel, more oil, more everything would win if it had the will to do so. The Second World War had proven this in both Europe and the Pacific. Germany had been buried under Allied production. Japan had been buried under American production. The margins were not close. They were overwhelming. Yet even this lesson had complexities. Material superiority alone was not sufficient. France in 1940 had possessed material advantages over Germany, yet had been defeated in weeks. The Soviet Union in 1941 had been pushed to the brink despite vast resources. Organization mattered, strategy mattered, will mattered. But when material superiority was as overwhelming as America's advantage over Japan, when the ratio was 10-1 across every critical measure, then other factors became secondary. The arithmetic was too stark to overcome. Nakamura spent the rest of his life in relative obscurity. He worked in post-war Japanese maritime industries, applying his analytical skills to civilian purposes. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime service. When historians occasionally sought him out for interviews, he answered their questions, but without drama or self-importance. He had been an intelligence officer doing his job. The fact that his job had revealed truths that his superiors did not want to hear was unfortunate, but not unique to him or to Japan. He died in 1978, outliving most of the senior officers who had attended his December 1944 briefing. By then, Japan had been transformed. The ruined nation of 1945 had become an economic powerhouse, a peaceful trading nation whose industrial output was among highest in the world. The irony was not lost on observers. Japan had achieved through commerce what it had failed to achieve through conquest. The industrial capacity that Japan had lacked in wartime had been built in peace, using many of the same organizational principles and manufacturing techniques that America had employed during the war. The story of Nakamura's report, of the 12,500 tons per day, became a footnote in most histories of the Pacific War. It was overshadowed by the dramatic battles, the atomic bombs, and the surrender ceremony. But within military logistics circles, it was studied as a case study in how intelligence can be accurate but ineffective, and how organizations can reject information that contradicts their operational premises. American logistics officers studied it to understand how the system they had built had appeared to their adversaries. They took professional pride in learning that Japanese intelligence had confirmed the scale of American supply operations. It validated the effort that thousands of logistics personnel had put into building and operating the supply chain. The cargo handlers, the truck drivers, the warehouse managers, the ship's crews, these largely anonymous participants in the war effort, had contributed to victory as surely as the combat troops, and Nakamura's report was evidence of that contribution. For those who study history, the 12,500 tons per day serves as a reminder of a basic truth. Wars are fought by soldiers but sustained by supplies. The courage of individual troops, the brilliance of commanders, the sophistication of weapons, all of these matter, but they exist within a framework of logistics that ultimately determines what is possible. An army without supplies cannot fight, no matter how brave its soldiers. A navy without fuel cannot sail, no matter how powerful its ships. An air force without bombs and aviation gasoline cannot attack, no matter how skilled its pilots. The Pacific War demonstrated this truth with mathematical precision. Japan had brave soldiers. No one who studied the battles could doubt the Japanese fighting spirit. Japan had skilled commanders who achieved tactical successes throughout the war. Japan had sophisticated weapons in some categories, particularly in naval aviation early in the conflict. But Japan could not sustain the industrial output necessary to fight a prolonged war against an opponent with 10 times its productive capacity. The number 12,500 represented more than tons of cargo. It represented the accumulated capacity of American farms that grew the food, American factories that produced the equipment, American mines that extracted the raw materials, American oil wells that pumped the fuel, American workers who built the ships, American sailors who crewed them, American ports that loaded them, American military personnel who distributed the supplies once they arrived. It represented an entire economic system mobilized for war, operating at a scale that Japan simply could not match. Understanding came too late for Japan. By the time Nakamura presented his findings in December 1944, 3 years of war had already inflicted catastrophic damage. Hundreds of thousands were dead. Cities were devastated. The merchant marine was destroyed. Industrial capacity was crippled. Even if Japan had sought peace in December 1944, the damage was already immense. The 9 additional months until surrender added enormously to the toll, but the fundamental outcome was already determined. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of the story. The information that might have led to earlier surrender existed. It was compiled, documented, and presented to decision-makers. But it was not acted upon. Institutional momentum, cultural imperatives, fear of dishonor, hope for miraculous salvation, all of these combined to keep the war going when the rational course would have been to seek peace. Wars end not when victory becomes impossible, but when all participants acknowledge that impossibility. Germany fought until Allied troops were in Berlin. Japan fought until atomic bombs demonstrated a level of destructive capability that made continued resistance seem pointless. The numbers, the production figures, the logistics data, the material disparities had been telling the same story for years. But numbers alone were not enough to end the war. It took the visceral impact of cities obliterated in instants to force the final acceptance of what the arithmetic had been saying all along. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.